Imagine this. You are a 12-year-old boy named Alexios, standing exposed on a marble platform in the Athenian Agora in the year 420 BCE, surrounded by the eyes of the city. Your hands tremble as wealthy men circle around you like vultures, examining your teeth, testing the firmness of your muscles, discussing your potential as if you were a prized horse. The morning sun casts long shadows across the marketplace. But the coldest thing touching your skin isn't the autumn air. It's the calculating gaze of Callicrates, a prominent politician whose villa overlooks the Acropolis. He nods to the slave trader and coins exchange hands. 40 drachmas, more than a skilled craftsman earns in 2 months. You've just been purchased not for labor in the mines or fields, but for something far more sinister. Your beauty has condemned you to a fate that will rob you of your childhood, your dignity, and ultimately your humanity. What you don't realize as you're dragged away from everything you've ever known is that you've just entered a system so brutally efficient, so culturally embedded, that it makes modern trafficking look like amateur hour. Think ancient Greece was all about democracy, philosophy, and athletic achievement? Think again, behind the marble columns and philosophical debates, the birthplace of Western civilization built its culture on the structured use of adolescent boys, turning them into symbols of status and aesthetic ideals, often serving the personal desires of powerful men. This wasn't some underground criminal enterprise. It was a celebrated institution, protected by law, blessed by poets, and considered essential to Greek education and culture. The evidence buried in ancient texts, legal documents, and philosophical treatises reveals a horror that makes your skin crawl. A world where unequal relationships between adults and youths were normalized, where prominent citizens openly surrounded themselves with adolescent companions, and where refusal or non-compliance could result not just in punishment, but in complete removal from social and civic life. You're about to discover how the civilization that gave us democracy simultaneously perfected the art of childhood destruction. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten histories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These buried voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's darkest corners. The Greek institution of pederasty wasn't aberrant behavior. It was the cornerstone of aristocratic culture, woven so deeply into the fabric of society that questioning it would have seemed as absurd as questioning the need for food or shelter. But here's what makes it truly terrifying. This wasn't just about sexual exploitation. It was a comprehensive system designed to break children psychologically, rebuild them as perfect servants, and then discard them when they aged out of usefulness. The selection process began in the slave markets of major Greek cities, but it extended far beyond simple commerce. Wealthy Greeks sent agents throughout the Mediterranean world, specifically hunting for the most beautiful boys they could find. These talent scouts operated in captured territories, seeking children whose families had been destroyed by war. They haunted the docks where families desperate enough might sell their own sons. They even maintained breeding programs on certain islands, treating human reproduction like livestock management. The ideal companion in such arrangements was typically between 10 and 15 years old, chosen for particular physical traits that were highly prized and idealized in Greek culture. Smooth skin unmarked by manual labor, bodies that hadn't yet developed adult masculine features, faces that could be described as ethereally beautiful. The Greeks wrote detailed treatises on the perfect concubine, analyzing features with the same clinical precision they applied to architecture or mathematics. But beauty wasn't enough. The perfect concubine needed intelligence, enough to be trained in music, poetry, and conversation, but not enough to pose a threat to his owner's superiority. Your new master, Callicrates, leads you through the narrow streets of Athens, past temples where citizens worship gods who supposedly protect the innocent, past the gymnasium where athletes train their bodies in celebration of human potential. The irony is suffocating. This civilization that claims to honor physical and intellectual excellence has just purchased you to corrupt both. His villa sits on the slopes of Mount Lycabettus, commanding a view of the entire city. Marble statues of gods and heroes line the pathways, their carved faces expressing the noble ideals that apparently don't apply to children. But here's where the horror truly begins. The training program that awaits you wasn't designed by sadists or criminals. It was developed by the most educated, cultured men in Greek society. Philosophers, poets, and statesmen worked together to construct a system that shaped young boys into idealized companions, all while preserving the illusion that it was a form of moral and intellectual development. They called it mentorship. They framed it as cultural transmission. They convinced themselves and society that they were doing you a favor. The daily routine in Callicrates' household begins before dawn with physical conditioning designed not to build strength, but to maintain the soft, youthful appearance that attracted him in the first place. You're bathed in milk and honey, your skin rubbed with oils that prevent the development of body hair. Your diet is carefully controlled to prevent you from growing too large or developing adult musculature. Exercise is limited to dancing and gymnastics that enhance grace rather than power. Every aspect of your physical development is artificially constrained to preserve the childlike qualities that define your value. Educational training occupies the middle portion of each day, but this isn't the broad curriculum available to free-born Greek boys. Instead, you're taught skills specifically designed to make you a more entertaining companion. Music lessons focus on songs that flatter your master's ego or accompany intimate moments. Poetry instruction centers on memorizing verses that celebrate your own beauty and submission. Conversation training teaches you to ask questions that make powerful men feel intelligent, while never expressing opinions that might challenge their authority. You're being educated to be intellectually stimulating enough to prevent boredom, but never threatening enough to be considered an equal. The evening instruction is where the true purpose of your existence becomes inescapably clear. This isn't just physical abuse. It's systematic psychological reconstruction designed to transform a normal child into a willing participant in his own degradation. The Greeks had developed sophisticated techniques for breaking down resistance and building dependency that rival modern psychological torture methods. They understood that simple force wouldn't create the compliant, enthusiastic companion they desired. They needed you to want to please them, to find your identity in satisfying their needs, to internalize their values so completely that escape would feel like self-destruction. The methods they used were diabolically effective because they combined reward and punishment in ways that confused your developing understanding of love, care, and safety. Callicrates alternates between showering you with gifts, praise, and affection when you perform well, and withdrawing all positive attention when you show any sign of resistance or independence. This creates a psychological dependency that makes you crave his approval even as you hate what you must do to earn it. You begin to measure your worth by his satisfaction, your identity by his desire, your safety by your ability to anticipate and fulfill his needs. But the individual psychological manipulation is only part of the system. The social structure of the household is designed to prevent solidarity among victims and ensure that competition replaces mutual support. Callicrates maintains several young concubines simultaneously, creating a hierarchy where survival depends on outperforming your fellow victims. The boy who pleases master most receives better food, finer clothing, and protection from the worst punishments. This forces children who should be allies against their oppressor to instead become rivals for scarce resources and temporary safety. The older boys in the household serve as overseers for newer arrivals, having internalized the system so completely that they enforce discipline more harshly than the master himself. They teach you the rules of survival, how to anticipate Callicrates' moods, which behaviors are rewarded, which punishments are most severe. But they also make clear that your position is temporary. As you age and lose the childlike appearance that defines your value, you'll be replaced by younger boys. This knowledge hangs over every day, making long-term planning impossible and ensuring that you focus entirely on immediate survival. The sexual exploitation that forms the core of your existence operates according to elaborate rituals and expectations that demonstrate just how normalized this abuse had become in Greek society. These aren't spontaneous acts of violence. They're ceremonial occasions with specific protocols, expectations, and even aesthetic requirements. The Greeks composed verses praising youthful beauty, produced art illustrating relationships between older men and adolescent boys, and developed philosophical systems that portrayed these customs as noble, despite the lasting impact they often had on the lives of the young. The symposium, the famous Greek drinking party where philosophers are said to have pursued lofty conversation, often included the presence of young boys in roles that, by modern standards, reflect deeply troubling forms of exploitation presented as entertainment. You and the other boys would be presented like living works of art, made to participate in gatherings of influential, educated men who saw no contradiction between intellectual debate and deeply troubling treatment of the young. These weren't underground gatherings of degenerates. They were the social events that defined Greek high culture, attended by the most respected members of society. Here's what makes the Greek system particularly insidious. They convinced themselves and their society that they were providing education and opportunity to underprivileged children. The mythology they created around pederasty framed it as mentorship, claiming that older men were transmitting wisdom, culture, and social connections to boys who wouldn't otherwise have access to such advantages. This self-serving narrative allowed them to exploit children, while maintaining their self-image as civilized, cultured, and even altruistic. The legal framework surrounding male concubinage reveals how deeply embedded this practice was in Greek society. There were specific laws governing the purchase, ownership, and treatment of boy slaves that treated them as a distinct category of property with their own regulations. The price controls ensured that beautiful boys remained affordable to the upper classes while preventing the lower classes from competing in the market. Quality standards required sellers to guarantee that boys were free from disease and properly trained in basic submission techniques. Ownership rights were absolute and comprehensive. Masters could sell, trade, or loan their concubines to other men without any legal restrictions. They could modify their bodies through castration or other procedures designed to preserve youthful appearance. They could punish resistance with any method short of murder, and even killing a concubine rarely resulted in serious legal consequences, as long as the owner could claim the death was accidental or justified by extreme disobedience. The contracts governing these transactions, preserved in ancient archives, read like livestock breeding agreements, rather than anything recognizing human dignity. They specify physical characteristics, sexual experience levels, training completion, and behavioral guarantees. Some include return policies allowing buyers to exchange concubines who didn't meet expectations. Others contain breeding clauses requiring concubines to produce children with female slaves, treating human reproduction as agricultural management. But here's where the systematic nature of Greek child exploitation becomes truly horrifying. They industrialized it. Major Greek cities maintained specialized markets where boys were sorted by age, appearance, and training level. Professional evaluators assessed new arrivals, categorizing them by their suitability for different types of service. Training schools operated like academies, with standardized curricula for producing concubines with specific skill sets. The entire system operated with the efficiency of modern manufacturing, turning the destruction of childhood into a profitable, regulated industry. The supply chain that fed this demand operated through multiple channels. that reveal the international scope of Greek child trafficking. Military campaigns specifically targeted children during conquests, with commanders reserving the most attractive captives for sale in Greek markets. Diplomatic relationships with barbarian tribes often included tribute requirements of young boys, making child trafficking a component of international relations. Pirates specialized in raiding coastal settlements to capture children, knowing that Greek buyers would pay premium prices for exotic specimens from distant lands. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the Mediterranean world, maintaining networks of informants who identified potential targets in poor families or vulnerable communities. They developed sophisticated techniques for capturing children without detection, often posing as traders or religious pilgrims to gain access to isolated settlements. The children would then be transported in specially designed ships with concealed compartments, arriving in Greek markets with forged documentation, claiming they were the children of deceased slaves or voluntary indentures. The breeding programs represent perhaps the most chilling aspect of Greek child exploitation. Certain islands in the Aegean became specialized production centers, where attractive slaves were forced to reproduce under controlled conditions, designed to maximize the beauty and compliance of their offspring. These children were raised from birth specifically to become concubines, never knowing any life outside the system that would eventually consume them. They were educated from infancy in submission, trained to find pleasure in serving masters, and psychologically conditioned to see their exploitation as natural and inevitable. The human cost of maintaining your artificial boyishness reveals the lengths to which Greek society would go to satisfy the desires of powerful men. The procedures used to prevent normal physical development weren't performed by back-alley butchers. They were conducted by respected physicians who had developed specialized expertise in modifying young bodies to maintain their commercial value. Castration was the most common intervention, performed not just to prevent reproduction, but to maintain high voices and smooth skin that buyers preferred. The surgical techniques were sophisticated enough to ensure high survival rates while achieving the desired aesthetic results. Boys destined for the highest levels of service might undergo partial castration that preserved some function while preventing full masculine development. Others received complete emasculation that turned them into living eunuchs whose modified bodies became permanent advertisements for their availability. The procedures were performed without anesthesia, using the pain as part of the psychological conditioning process that taught boys that their bodies existed solely for others' pleasure. Chemical treatments supplemented surgical interventions to fine-tune physical development according to market demands. Hormonal manipulations using plant-based compounds could delay or prevent puberty, maintaining childlike appearances well into the teenage years. Skin treatments using acidic compounds removed body hair and maintained the smooth texture that Greek men fetishized. Dietary restrictions combined with medicinal supplements controlled muscle development, ensuring that concubines remained physically weak and dependent on their masters for protection. The psychological impact of these modifications extended far beyond the physical changes. Boys who underwent such procedures were marked permanently as sexual objects, unable to integrate into normal society, even if they somehow achieved freedom. The visible signs of their modification announced their purpose to anyone who saw them, making escape impossible and ensuring that they remained dependent on the system that had created them. What makes the medical profession's involvement in this systematic abuse particularly disturbing is how they rationalized their participation. Greek physicians wrote treatises on the optimal timing and techniques for modifying young bodies, approaching child mutilation with the same clinical detachment they applied to treating diseases. They developed rating systems for evaluating surgical results and competing with colleagues to achieve the most aesthetically pleasing modifications. The perverted application of medical knowledge to satisfy adult sexual preferences represents one of history's most disgusting examples of professional ethics, completely corrupted by cultural normalization. The daily existence of a male concubine in ancient Greece was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological dependency while preventing any development of personal identity or autonomous will. Every aspect of your life, from the clothes you wore to the thoughts you were allowed to express, was controlled by men who saw you as a sophisticated toy designed for their entertainment. The Greeks had perfected techniques for maintaining compliance that were more effective than simple physical restraint because they convinced victims to police themselves. Morning routines began with inspection and preparation that reinforced your status as an object rather than a person. You would be examined for any signs of aging, illness, or resistance that might reduce your value. Your body would be groomed according to your master's preferences, with every detail from hair length to nail condition, subject to his approval. The clothing you wore was selected not for comfort or protection, but to display your body in ways that advertised your availability and enhanced your appeal to potential viewers. Educational activities during the day served dual purposes of maintaining your mental stimulation while reinforcing your subordinate position. The music you learned consisted entirely of songs that celebrated your master's greatness or your own submission. The poetry you memorized praised the beauty of boys and the wisdom of older men who guided them. The philosophical discussions you were allowed to observe taught you that questioning authority was the mark of an inferior mind, while obedience demonstrated wisdom and virtue. Physical exercise was strictly controlled to maintain your appearance within narrow parameters that preserved your commercial value. You were forbidden from activities that might build muscle mass or develop adult masculine characteristics. Instead, your exercise consisted of dancing, stretching, and graceful movements designed to enhance your appeal as a delicate, youthful companion. Any attempt to engage in normal childhood play or competitive activities would result in punishment for attempting to exceed your proper station. The evening activities that formed the core of your existence as a concubine involved elaborate rituals designed to transform abuse into ceremony. These weren't simple acts of sexual violence. They were theatrical performances where you were expected to demonstrate enthusiasm, gratitude, and devotion to masters who were destroying your childhood. The Greeks had developed sophisticated techniques for forcing victims to participate actively in their own exploitation, using psychological manipulation that was more effective than physical coercion. Social isolation was perhaps the most effective tool for maintaining control over concubines like yourself. You were forbidden from forming meaningful relationships with anyone outside the household, preventing you from developing support networks that might encourage resistance or provide alternative perspectives on your situation. Even relationships with other concubines were carefully monitored and controlled to prevent the formation of alliances that might threaten your master's authority. The prohibition against developing autonomous thoughts or opinions was enforced through constant surveillance and immediate punishment for any sign of independent thinking. You learned to anticipate your master's desires before he expressed them, to mirror his emotions, and to find your entire sense of self-worth in his approval. This psychological conditioning was so effective that many concubines lost the ability to function independently even if they somehow achieved freedom. Having been so thoroughly programmed for dependency that autonomy felt like terror rather than liberation. The competitive dynamic among concubines in the same household prevented solidarity and ensured that victims focused their energy on surviving internal hierarchies rather than challenging the system itself. Boys who had been purchased more recently looked to older concubines for guidance, but those older boys had usually internalized the system so completely that they enforced discipline more harshly than the masters themselves. They had learned that temporary privileges and protection could be earned by helping to break in new arrivals, creating a cycle where victims became participants in their own oppression. The aging out process that all concubines faced created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that prevented long-term planning or hope for the future. You knew that your value depended entirely on maintaining characteristics that time would inevitably erode. The older concubines in the household served as living reminders of what awaited you. Boys who had once been prized for their beauty, now reduced to menial servants as younger replacements captured their master's attention. This knowledge made every day a desperate struggle to maintain whatever advantage you possessed while watching helplessly as that advantage slowly slipped away. But here's what makes the Greek system of child exploitation particularly ingenious in its cruelty. They created an entire cultural mythology that celebrated this abuse as beneficial to the victims. The literary tradition of ancient Greece is filled with poems, plays, and philosophical treatises that praise the beauty of boys and the wisdom of men who guided their development through intimate relationships. This wasn't underground pornography. It was high art, celebrated by the most educated members of society and preserved as cultural treasures for future generations. The philosophical justifications developed by Greek thinkers like Plato reveal how sophisticated minds could convince themselves that child exploitation served noble purposes. They argued that boys benefited from the attention of older men who could teach them about virtue, beauty, and truth through intimate relationships. They claimed that physical attraction was merely the beginning of a spiritual journey that would elevate both participants to higher levels of understanding. They maintained that society as a whole benefited when experienced men transmitted their wisdom to the next generation through these special bonds. This intellectual framework allowed Greek society to practice systematic child abuse while maintaining their self-image as the pinnacle of human civilization. They convinced themselves that they were providing education, opportunity, and cultural refinement to boys who wouldn't otherwise have access to such advantages. The mythology was so persuasive that victims often internalized it themselves, believing that their suffering was somehow noble and their exploitation was actually a privilege. The artistic representations of pederasty in Greek culture reveal how completely normalized this abuse had become. Pottery, sculptures, and frescoes depicted intimate relationships between men and boys with the same aesthetic celebration applied to any other aspect of Greek life. These weren't hidden pornographic materials. They were decorative objects displayed proudly in homes and public spaces, announcing to visitors that the household's inhabitants participated in culturally approved forms of sophisticated entertainment. The poetry celebrating boy love wasn't written by social outcasts, asapum, or underground perverts. It was composed by the most respected literary figures of ancient Greece. These poems were recited at public festivals, taught in schools, and memorized by educated citizens as examples of cultural refinement. The language used to describe the exploitation of children was elevated, romantic, and beautiful, creating an aesthetic veneer that disguised the brutal reality of what was actually happening to young victims. The symposium tradition institutionalized child abuse as intellectual entertainment, combining philosophical discussion with the sexual exploitation of boys in ways that satisfied both the mind and the body of Greek elites. These gatherings weren't secret orgies. They were the primary form of social and intellectual engagement among the upper classes, where business was conducted, political alliances were formed, and cultural values were transmitted. The presence of exploited children wasn't incidental to these functions. It was integral to demonstrating the wealth, sophistication, and cultural achievement of the hosts. This cultural celebration of child exploitation created a feedback loop that made the system increasingly difficult to challenge or escape. When the greatest poets of your civilization write verses praising your beauty and submission, when the most respected philosophers argue that your exploitation serves noble purposes, when the most sophisticated artworks of your culture depict your abuse as aesthetic achievement, how can you possibly maintain the belief that you are being wronged? The psychological impact of having your destruction celebrated as cultural advancement represents a form of gaslighting so comprehensive that it could break minds that physical torture couldn't touch. The economic infrastructure supporting male concubinage in ancient Greece reveals the industrial scale of this systematic child abuse and how deeply embedded it was in the financial life of major cities. This wasn't a marginal activity pursued by a few wealthy perverts. It was a significant sector of the Greek economy that employed thousands of people and generated substantial tax revenue for city-states. The normalization of child trafficking as legitimate commerce demonstrates how completely Greek society had integrated the destruction of childhood into their definition of civilized life. Specialized markets operated in every major Greek city, with permanent facilities designed specifically for the display and sale of young boys. These weren't general slave markets where children were sold alongside adult laborers. They were boutique establishments, catering to buyers seeking concubines with specific characteristics and training levels. The architecture of these markets reveals their cultural significance. Elaborate colonnades, marble platforms for displaying merchandise, private examination rooms where buyers could inspect potential purchases, and administrative offices where complex contracts were negotiated and recorded. Professional appraisers worked in these markets, developing expertise in evaluating the commercial potential of young boys with the same clinical precision applied to assessing livestock or precious objects. They examined physical characteristics, tested educational achievements, and evaluated behavioral compliance to determine appropriate pricing and placement. These evaluators developed standardized rating systems that reduced children to collections of marketable attributes, stripping away any recognition of their humanity in favor of commercial classification. The training industry that supported the concubine trade operated specialized schools where captured or purchased boys were processed into marketable commodities. These institutions relied on trained instructors who crafted programs aimed at shaping impressionable youth into obedient companions, all while upholding the illusion that they were offering education and advancement. The school operators marketed their services to buyers seeking concubines with specific skill sets, offering customized training programs that could modify children according to purchaser specifications. Financial instruments developed around the concubine trade demonstrate how sophisticated the market had become. Buyers could purchase insurance policies protecting their investment against damage, illness, or death. Lending institutions offered financing for expensive purchases, using the concubines themselves as collateral. Futures contracts allowed buyers to reserve children who were still too young for immediate use, paying premium prices for guaranteed delivery when the boys reached optimal age and development. The taxation structure applied to concubine sales provided substantial revenue for Greek city-states, making governments financially dependent on the continuation of child trafficking. Tax collectors specialized in evaluating concubine transactions, developing expertise in identifying undervalued sales, and ensuring that appropriate duties were collected. The revenue generated from these taxes funded public works, military campaigns, and cultural activities, meaning that Greek achievements in architecture, art, and literature were literally built on the systematic exploitation of children. Maintenance costs for households keeping multiple concubines created secondary markets for specialized goods and services. Perfumers developed products specifically for maintaining youthful appearance in aging boys. Physicians offered surgical procedures for modifying bodies according to changing aesthetic preferences. Trainers provided instruction in new skills as market demands evolved. This economic ecosystem surrounding child exploitation employed hundreds of professionals whose livelihoods depended on the continuation of institutionalized abuse. The investment strategies employed by wealthy Greeks often included concubine portfolios balanced according to age, appearance, and training to maximize both immediate satisfaction and long-term value retention. Boys purchased young could be developed over several years to meet specific requirements, then sold at peak value to buyers seeking fully trained companions. Alternatively, buyers could purchase pre-trained concubines for immediate use, paying premium prices for the convenience of avoiding development costs and risks. But here's what makes the economic structure of Greek child exploitation particularly horrifying. It was designed to be self-perpetuating and expanding rather than simply exploitative. The profits generated from concubine sales funded the acquisition of new inventory, creating growth cycles that required increasing numbers of children to satisfy expanding markets. The professional infrastructure developed around the trade created vested interests, in its continuation among people who might otherwise have been indifferent to child welfare. Regional specialization emerged as different areas developed reputations for producing concubines with particular characteristics or skills. Islands in the Aegean became known for breeding programs that produced children with specific physical traits. Coastal cities specialized in capturing exotic specimens from foreign lands. Mountain communities developed expertise in training boys for particular types of service. This geographic distribution of the industry made it impossible to eliminate through local action, while creating economic incentives for cooperation among different regions. The resistance and escape attempts by male concubines in ancient Greece faced obstacles so comprehensive and systematic that freedom was nearly impossible to achieve or maintain. The Greeks had learned from centuries of experience with slave management and had developed sophisticated techniques for preventing rebellion while maintaining the docile, enthusiastic demeanor that made concubines valuable. Every aspect of your environment was designed to crush hope while maintaining the appearance of willing participation. Physical escape from your master's household required overcoming multiple layers of security that treated human captives like valuable artwork requiring protection from theft. The buildings where concubines were housed featured architectural modifications specifically designed to prevent unauthorized departures. Windows too small for human passage, doors that locked from the outside, interior courtyards surrounded by high walls topped with broken pottery or metal spikes. Guard rotations ensured constant surveillance, with household slaves whose job was specifically to monitor concubines and report any suspicious behavior. Even if you managed to leave the building, escaping the city presented insurmountable challenges. Ancient Greek cities were closed communities where strangers were immediately noticeable and questioned by authorities. Your appearance, carefully maintained in ways that marked you as a concubine, would identify you to anyone who saw you. The lack of body hair, artificially maintained youthful features, and distinctive clothing worn by concubines functioned as permanent identification tags that announced your status to potential captors. The legal framework surrounding escaped concubines made recapture almost inevitable. Any free citizen who helped a runaway slave faced severe penalties, creating financial incentives for reporting fugitives rather than assisting them. Professional slave catchers operated bounty systems that rewarded anyone providing information about escaped concubines. Local authorities maintained registries of missing slaves with detailed descriptions that circulated throughout Greek territories. But the most effective barriers to escape were psychological rather than physical. The conditioning process that transformed normal children into compliant concubines was designed to make freedom feel more terrifying than continued captivity. Boys who had been systematically stripped of autonomous decision-making ability found the prospect of independence overwhelming rather than appealing. The outside world had been presented to them as dangerous, hostile, and filled with people who would treat them far worse than their current masters. The dependency relationships created between concubines and their masters often resembled Stockholm Syndrome, where victims developed emotional attachments to their captors that made escape feel like abandonment rather than liberation. Boys who had been conditioned to find their entire sense of worth in pleasing their masters experienced psychological crisis when separated from the source of their identity. The approval and occasional kindness shown by masters became addictive, making the uncertainty of freedom less appealing than the predictable structure of captivity. Financial realities created additional barriers to successful escape. Concubines had no independent access to money or resources that could support them during flight or help them establish new lives. The skills they had been taught were specifically designed for pleasing masters rather than independent survival. Their education, while sophisticated in certain areas, had deliberately excluded practical knowledge about navigation, commerce, or self-defense that could facilitate escape. Social stigma attached to former concubines made integration into normal society extremely difficult, even for those who achieved physical freedom. The modifications performed on their bodies marked them permanently as former sexual slaves. preventing them from hiding their past or assuming new identities. The psychological conditioning they had undergone often left them unable to form normal relationships or function in environments that required autonomous decision-making. The few documented cases of successful escape reveal the extraordinary circumstances required to overcome these obstacles. Some concubines managed to flee during military campaigns when their masters were distracted by combat and normal security arrangements broke down. Others escaped during natural disasters that created chaos sufficient to mask their departure. A very few managed to convince sympathetic household members to assist their flight, though such assistance was extremely rare and dangerous for the helpers. However, even successful escape rarely led to genuine freedom. The skills concubines possessed were primarily valuable in contexts that involved continued sexual exploitation, leading many escapees to become prostitutes or seek new masters rather than achieving true independence. The psychological damage inflicted during their conditioning often prevented them from developing the emotional resilience needed for autonomous living, making them vulnerable to re-exploitation by opportunistic predators. Suicide represented the most common form of resistance among concubines who found their situations unbearable but escape impossible. The methods available were limited by the controlled environment and constant supervision, but determined boys found ways to end their suffering through hanging, drowning, poison ingestion, or deliberate provocation of fatal punishment. The frequency of suicide among concubines was high enough that masters developed specific strategies for prevention, including removal of potential implements and psychological manipulation designed to maintain hope for improved treatment. The organized resistance that did emerge among concubines was typically small-scale and quickly suppressed, but reveals the courage and desperation of children trapped in impossible circumstances. Boys sometimes coordinated group refusals to participate in required activities, accepting collective punishment in solidarity with their fellow victims. Others engaged in sabotage of household property or interference with their master's social activities as forms of passive resistance that expressed their hatred while avoiding direct confrontation. But here's what makes the Greek system of control particularly insidious. They had perfected techniques for channeling resistance into forms that actually reinforce the system rather than challenging it. Competitive dynamics among concubines meant that rebellion by one boy often led to increased compliance by others seeking to demonstrate their superiority and earn privileges. The psychological conditioning was so effective that many victims genuinely believed their masters cared for them and that their exploitation was somehow beneficial, making them willing participants in their own oppression. The cultural normalization of child exploitation in ancient Greece created an environment where resistance was not only practically difficult, but psychologically almost impossible to sustain. When the entire society around you celebrates your abuse as cultural achievement, when the greatest minds of your civilization argue that your exploitation serves noble purposes, when the most beautiful art of your culture depicts your suffering as aesthetic accomplishment, how can you maintain the belief that you deserve better treatment? The comprehensive nature of the psychological warfare conducted against concubines represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of systematic mind control. The aging out process for male concubines in ancient Greece represented the final cruelty of a system that had already stolen their childhood, identity, and future possibilities. By the time you reached your late teens or early 20s, the physical characteristics that had made you valuable began to disappear, replaced by adult features that reduced your appeal to masters who preferred boyish companions. This transition was carefully monitored and managed to maximize the remaining value that could be extracted from your transformed body while preparing for your eventual disposal. The first signs of aging, the appearance of body hair, the deepening of your voice, the development of adult musculature, were treated as commercial failures requiring immediate intervention. Masters employed various techniques to delay or disguise these changes, from continued use of depilatory treatments to surgical procedures designed to maintain youthful appearance. Some boys were subjected to repeated castration procedures intended to prevent further masculine development, while others received cosmetic modifications that could hide the visual evidence of maturation. But these interventions could only delay the inevitable decline in your market value and sexual appeal. Masters who had once competed for your attention began to lose interest as newer, younger boys captured their preferences. The emotional manipulation that had defined your relationship with your owner shifted from seduction and reward to indifference and eventual contempt. You found yourself relegated to less prestigious roles within the household while watching new acquisitions receive the attention and privileges you once enjoyed. The psychological impact of this transition was devastating for boys who had been conditioned to define their worth entirely through their ability to please their masters. The gradual withdrawal of attention and affection triggered identity crises that many former concubines never fully recovered from. Having spent their formative years learning that their value as human beings depended on maintaining impossible standards of beauty and compliance, they had no psychological framework for understanding their worth outside the exploitative relationships that had defined their existence. The disposal process for aging concubines revealed the ultimate disposability of victims within the Greek system. Masters had several options for dealing with boys who had exceeded their useful lifespan, none of which involved genuine care for their welfare or recognition of their humanity. The most common solution was resale to buyers seeking older slaves for different types of labor, typically at dramatically reduced prices that reflected their diminished sexual value. Some former concubines were transferred to brothels where their experience with sexual service could be monetized in different markets. Others were sold to masters who specialized in owning former concubines, creating secondary markets for boys who retained some appeal despite their aging. The most fortunate might be retained as household servants, trading their sexual availability for basic survival needs, though this arrangement typically involved continued exploitation under different terms. The least fortunate former concubines faced abandonment or execution when their masters decided they represented more cost than value. Boys who had become too attached to their owners, who knew too many household secrets, or who showed signs of psychological instability were often eliminated as potential threats to their former masters' reputations. The casual disposal of human beings who had served for years demonstrated the complete absence of emotional attachment or moral responsibility felt by men who had systematically exploited children. The few former concubines who achieved something resembling freedom faced overwhelming challenges in creating independent lives. The skills they possessed were primarily valuable in contexts involving continued sexual exploitation, limiting their employment opportunities to prostitution or service in industries where their experience with submission could be utilized. The psychological conditioning they had undergone often prevented them from developing the emotional resilience and autonomous decision-making abilities required for independent survival. Social stigma attached to former concubines made integration into normal society extremely difficult. The visible modifications performed on their bodies marked them permanently as former sexual slaves, preventing them from hiding their past or assuming new identities. Free citizens who might have employed them for legitimate labor were often reluctant to associate with individuals whose backgrounds involved sexual service, limiting their opportunities for establishing respectable careers. The emotional damage inflicted during their conditioning often manifested in destructive behaviors that further limited their ability to build stable lives. Many former concubines struggled with depression, anxiety, and attachment disorders that made normal relationships impossible. Others developed substance abuse problems or engaged in self-destructive behaviors as coping mechanisms for processing their traumatic experiences. The absence of support systems or treatment resources meant that most former concubines remained psychologically damaged for the remainder of their lives. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the aging out process was how completely it isolated former concubines from any possibility of justice or recognition of the wrongs committed against them. Greek society offered no mechanisms for acknowledging the systematic abuse they had endured or providing compensation for the damage inflicted on their lives. Instead, they were expected to be grateful for the cultural education and social exposure they had received, with any complaints about their treatment dismissed as ingratitude or misunderstanding of the benefits they had gained. The mythology surrounding pederasty continued to frame their exploitation.